Troy was released in 2004 and was directed by Wolfgang Petersen and stars Brad Pitt, Eric Bana, Sean Bean, and Orlando Bloom, and is an adaptation of Homer's great epic which follows the assault on Troy by the united Greek forces and chronicles the fates of the men involved. I reviewed Troy a few years ago, right before I did the big revamp of my channel, and like many of my older reviews, I've been meaning to revisit them and improve them in the same way I did with my revisits of my Disney and Harry Potter reviews. I wasn't intending on revisiting this film so soon, but after getting the urge to rewatch it just a few days ago, I realized just how much I still had to say about this really overlooked historical epic. This is a film I absolutely love watching every once in a while. It's not really a favorite film of mine, but it is one I love just as much as if it were. And there's a lot about it that I feel went missed by critics during its initial release that were then rectified in the film's director's cut. But before we get into all that, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. In 2000, Gladiator was released and proved to be both a critical and commercial success, coming away with $503 million on a $103 million budget. And it would later go on to win Best Picture at the Oscars and has remained a big influence all these years later. It was also responsible for creating the big historical epic boom of the early 2000s, where big-budget historical epics in the vein of those seen in the 1950s and 60s were coming out yearly. So, in the wake of Gladiator, we got movies like The Last Samurai, Alexander, Kingdom of Heaven, and of course, Troy. Troy started out as a project penned by David Benioff, who had recently found success with the Spike Lee adaptation of his novel 25th Hour, which he adapted himself. After a successful pitch for the project, he got started right away on writing. At the time, there were multiple directors offered the chance to direct the film, one of those being Christopher Nolan, who had recently begun a relationship with Warner Brothers, but he declined the offer to instead work on his reinvention of Batman. Eventually, the film was offered to German director Wolfgang Petersen, known for such movies as his epic Das Boot, The Neverending Story, and the political thriller Air Force One. Though Brad Pitt was originally reluctant to star in the film, he eventually accepted the role only because of contractual obligation. Rose Byrne was also offered the role of Briseis on Eric Bana's recommendation after Bollywood actress Aishwarya Rai stepped down due to not being comfortable doing the love scenes between her and Brad Pitt. The city of Troy was built on the island of Malta from April to June of 2003, and other important scenes for the film were shot just north of there. Troy's outer walls were built and filmed in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. Famously, production was halted several times, once by Hurricane Marty, and another time after Brad Pitt injured, of all things, his Achilles tendon. The movie was originally supposed to be composed by Gabriel Yared, but he was let go after reactions to test screenings were negative when it came to the film's score. James Horner was then hired to replace Yared and tried to evoke a more Eastern Mediterranean style of music. Horner would also work with Josh Groban on an original song that would play during the film's end credits, but be cut out of the director's cut of the film. Troy was released in the US on May 14th of 2004, and on a budget of $185 million, it made a promising gross of $497.4 million. At the time, it was one of the most expensive films ever made. Critically, the film received mainly mixed to average reviews, and even those who starred in the film were also critical of portions of it. Peter O'Toole would famously call Wolfgang Petersen a clown. Criticism was also placed on Benioff, who would go on to create the Game of Thrones TV series, for perhaps taking on too much material at once, and it wasn't able to fully convey the ideas of its source material. All that said, this didn't stop the film from being a huge success commercially, and it would even make a splash in home video sales, with a director's cut eventually being released and added in about 30 minutes of deleted material, and most who have seen the director's cut see it as the definitive version, fixing several problems with the theatrical version overall. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go into my thoughts on the film. Troy is not my favorite of the historical epics that came out during the early 2000s in the wake of the success of Gladiator. I do prefer films like Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven and, of course, Alexander, which is my favorite film of all time. But I feel like Troy is the one film around this time that comes the closest to replicating the look and style of a traditional epic. There's shots in this film that feel like they could have been photographed in the 1950s and 60s, along with movies like The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, and to reference a more recent review of mine, Cleopatra. For those that don't know, the historical epic is my favorite film genre of all time, and I've put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into exploring this genre, and it's hard to find a modern epic that feels like it could have been made 50 years prior, and that's what Troy is. With the best compliments to its director, Wolfgang Petersen created a film that feels absolutely massive in scale and provides, for me at least, most of the big trappings that make up an epic. It has the 3-hour plus runtime, a huge cast of well-known stars, a cast of thousands, a mix of real-world locations and exotic sets, absolutely stunning costumes, an epic score, and sweeping cinematography. Not to say movies like Gladiator, Alexander, and Kingdom of Heaven didn't have any of these, but Troy just managed to do it the best. Troy shines the most when we focus on the things that make it an epic. Everything about the production is just beautiful. The handcrafted sets, for example, are an absolute treat to see. The locations are so grand in scale, from the interiors of the Trojan Palace to the gates of Troy itself. Everything feels larger than life and so real. It feels like those old epics in the best ways. One impressive piece from the production has to be the Trojan horse itself, which plays an important part in the film's climax. It's so large in scale, and unlike the typical image of the Trojan horse we're more used to seeing. Credit also has to be given to the costumes as well. I love the designs of the clothing. The dresses in particular for Helen and Andromache are beautiful and exotic, and the armor that everyone wears just looks so good on the screen. I like how they paid so much attention to details that you can see a distinct difference between the armor of the Trojans versus the armor of the Greeks. And within the Greeks themselves, there's different sets of armor because they all come from different city-states. I particularly like the design of the Trojan armor, especially the ones worn by Hector and Paris in the film. There's something very old world and princely about them. Troy very much is a movie about putting beautiful people in beautiful costumes, and there's nothing wrong with that. The cinematography is also gorgeous to look at. As I said, the way the film is framed, sometimes it looks like we're transported back to the epics of the 50s and 60s, and that's really a great accomplishment for director of photography Roger Pratt, who, after doing my research, is the same DP who worked on Chamber of Secrets and Goblet of Fire. Both of those films also had a very grand look to them, much like with this film. The water scenes are particularly impressive, even when we move from seeing real ships on screen to CGI ships. There's also some very inventive shots that aren't groundbreaking by any means, but do a good job of conveying particular emotions, such as when Paris goes out to face Menelaus. There's these first-person point-of-view shots as we are seeing through his helmet, as we see the world through his eyes as a boy that's clearly a bit in over his head. Then we come to the other technical aspects like the music. James Horner was the composer for the film after Gabriel Yared was let go, and I think he does an excellent job of providing a score that is sweeping and epic in all the best ways. I'm a big fan of Horner's music. Titanic, in particular, is one of my favorite movie scores of all time. But his music here is thrilling, romantic, and grand. My favorite piece of his from the entire film is actually the one played during the fight scene between Hector and Achilles. It's tense with a constant beat pulsing. It's matched perfectly with the fight scene in the theatrical cut, at least. From what I've been able to find, Petersen was not completely satisfied with Horner's score, and in the director's cut, he does what he can to manipulate or change it, and most moments like this are not too apparent until we get to that epic fight scene and the music is replaced by, of all things, Danny Elfman's theme from Planet of the Apes remake. It's a good piece, but gone is the truly perfect effect that scene originally had. The battle scenes are also just glorious to watch and hyper-violent and shot in a way that you can clearly see what's happening at all times, which I always appreciate. The Siege of Troy is grand, and watching the maneuvering of soldiers on the battlefield is thrilling to watch. But the moments of single combat throughout the film are the moments that really shine for me. From the larger scaled scenes of Achilles and his Myrmidons fighting at the Temple of Apollo, to Achilles and Hector's fight, to Tyler Mane hamming it up and being a great destructive force as Ajax. It all looks wonderful and is really fun to watch. I wanted to get all of the technical aspects of the film out of the way before moving forward with things like the performances, characters, and writing, because I think some of that is where the film falters some. But overall, this is a beautiful looking film, and Petersen knew what he was doing when he shot this film, and it feels so grand and like a true spectacle. Now, the performances, I think, range from straight up excellent to simply passable, and some of this comes from the performers themselves, but the writing is also to blame as well. For the most part, I think many of the characters are written very flat. They're not all that interesting, and there's the bare minimum of depth to them to get you to care. Benioff's script isn't bad, though. It just feels rough and perhaps could have worked with more seasoned writing or a rewrite to make these characters really memorable. I think the biggest offender of just being totally bland are Brad Pitt as Achilles and Orlando Bloom's Paris and Diane Kruger's Helen. They are just not given the best material to work with. Paris is pretty stock in how he's represented, and Bloom's performance is just very bland, and his chemistry with Diane Kruger is pretty much non-existent. You have these two sexy people and a blustery romance that's supposed to be something worth fighting for, and there's just nothing in the performances that conveys that very well. Brad Pitt also just doesn't seem like his heart is in it and feels like he's sleepwalking through his performance, giving the bare minimum. Now, I have heard that he really didn't want the role, and sadly it shows in this film. He just brings little enthusiasm to the role, and during the film's big emotional moments, they just don't land. Take, for example, the death of Patroclus, Achilles' cousin. There's this big moment where Patroclus has taken Achilles' armor, posing as him, and then falls in battle, and Achilles is given the news. Pitt's acting in this moment feels so stilted and kind of hilarious, as he tries to be emotional, but it never lands. It also doesn't help that the script failed to do anything but the bare minimum when looking at Achilles and Patroclus' relationship. And I think part of what's missing is the romantic angle, since in the original story, Achilles and Patroclus are lovers instead of cousins. If we had that, maybe it would have had a better effect, or maybe if Pitt performed his scenes with more enthusiasm, or maybe they just did a better job of writing the characters, it could have worked. There are great performances in this, though. Brian Cox and Brendan Gleeson bring a lot of life to their roles, and bring the right amount of class and high energy to their roles. And Eric Bana is also fantastic. I love Eric Bana, and I think we really need to have more of him in some really good, meaty roles, because he's great here. I feel his pain and fears, his love for his wife, child, family, and city, and it's all done through his performance. And when he dies in the film, it is a very effective one, because the script does a good job of getting me to care about him. I also think the film does an excellent job of adapting the final scene from Homer's Iliad, where King Priam visits Achilles after Hector's death and asks for his body back. But the dialogue is so good here, and though it's not taken directly from the Iliad, it manages to get the same ideas across in a great way. Peter O'Toole is just a great actor anyway, but how he delivers the line, "I've done what no man has done before. I've kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." And in this moment, I think Brad Pitt actually does something right by showing the vulnerability of his character and breaking down and crying. And after being so angry throughout the film, to see that moment is deeply rewarding. Troy is a flawed film, but it also has incredible production value. The cinematography makes it look like an old school epic in a way the modern epics of the early 2000s couldn't replicate. The sets and costumes are just so cool to see and really engrosses you in the world like those old epics. The battles are bloody and entertaining, and some of the performances and individual scenes are inspiring. The film mostly has a problem with characterization and some pretty flat characters and flat acting from very important characters, which I think ruins some of the bigger and most integral parts of the film. Also, the choice of having the music from Planet of the Apes will never make sense to me, and that fight scene doesn't have nearly the same impact as the one in the theatrical version. But yet, this is a film I still love. It has things wrong in it, but it makes up for it with other things, and it's one of my favorites from this era of historical epics. So, with all of that said, I'm going to give Troy an 8 out of 10. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this review. This was one I've been wanting to talk about again recently, and it's one I really enjoy watching, and hopefully this time around, my overall thoughts were a bit more clear. If you've seen Troy, what do you think about it? And if you haven't, I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in this kind of thing and want to see some really good filmmaking on display. But as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.